Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Learning from Leaders series. In this series, I'm interviewing national leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, our guest is Dr. Ron Hassner, a professor in political science at UC Berkeley and the faculty director of the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. Mr. Hassner, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
So, could you just start us off by explaining the focus of your research about international security and the relationship between religion and violence?
Gladly. So I started studying political science as a graduate student, started studying it seriously in the late 1990s, and then very much influenced by the events of 9/11, political scientists became more and more interested in the relationship between religion and violence. They studied it pretty narrowly, I felt, with an overemphasis on terrorism, a strong emphasis on Islam, and I wanted to broaden that lens a little. And so my first book was on disputes over holy places around the world. Jerusalem is an obvious case. There are holy places that are disputed all around the world, in Israel, in the Middle East, but also in India, in the United States. So that was my first book, where I tried to understand why these disputes were hard to resolve. And then in my second and third book, I looked at militaries. And I tried to study how religion affects the behavior of regular soldiers. So in contrast to my colleagues who were studying, fanatical suicide bombers, I was interested in seeing how your average Christian Marine or your, Canadian Jewish soldier or your Israeli soldier, a soldier from India, how your religion might shape where you fight, how you fight, which units you join, how you're promoted. And so that resulted in one book, which compares militaries around the world, and a second book, which looks at the influence of religion on war making, especially in World War I and World War II. And now my research has shifted to a different direction. I am interested in torture. The ethics of torture, the morality of torture. I've spent about 5 years studying the Spanish Inquisition. So this is primarily the torture of Jews for being Jewish and pretending to be Christian. And I'm interested in the results of torture, including torture conducted by the United States.
Wow. And so one of the classes that you teach is War in the Middle East. Do you think that there's some overarching themes that are consistent?
Consistent how? Consistent across wars in the Middle East?
Yes.
Many. So, in part, I thought it was important to teach a class like that in the United States and on a very politicized campus where people often hold very strong opinions without knowing very much. I conducted a survey a couple of years ago, and I published the results in an op-ed in the Times of Israel, asking students how strongly they felt about different conflicts in different parts of the world, and they felt very strongly about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then I asked them some basic questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Like, how many Israelis are there? And the answers ranged from 5,000 to 50 million. Like, people are clueless. I asked, these are Berkeley students. I asked them, where are the Palestinian territories? And 75% couldn't find the Palestinian territories on a map, including people who thought that they were west of Lebanon, meaning they had never opened a map of the Middle East, ever. So I thought it was very important to teach a class like that. And we do teach the class. It's not a history class. It's an international politics class. So we do look at overarching themes, democracy and the absence of democracy in the Middle East, disputes over borders, not just in the Israeli case, but Morocco, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, etc. Occupations and struggles for independence, not just Palestinians, but Cypriots, Kurds, Sahrawis, various communities around the Middle East. Conflicts motivated by resources, the role of religion, the role of the military in stabilizing or destabilizing societies. So that's sort of the purpose of the class. And students read a lot of very, very confusing information. And they tell me that they come out of the class with an appreciation for context and subtlety. The number one lesson that I try to impress students on in my different classes on war is that there are no bad guys and no good guys. Everybody's a bad guy. It's just a question of how bad. So that's the goal of that class.
And at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, what characteristics really make it unique from like any other campus that has that type of group?
Right. So we've just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. We are the largest and most ambitious such institute in the United States. We bring about somewhere between 5 and 10 Israeli professors to Berkeley every year. And each of those professors teaches 2 or 3 classes across campus in a whole range of topics: history, philosophy, law, economics, gender, theater, journalism, anything. Some of these classes are really closely related to Israel. Some are not. Some are just having an Israeli professor on campus, giving you their point of view on whatever, microeconomics or sociology. We have undergraduate fellows, about 20 every year, who teach their own classes on Israel and who do research. We do public events. We do smaller events just for faculty or faculty and graduate students. And we sponsor now summer classes in Israel. And again, I think an institute like that is more necessary on a campus like Berkeley than just about anywhere else. And it's really changed the face of the campus. It's changed the way people understand Israel, talk about Israel, study Israel. I think it's introduced a sense of openness. That, together with the fact that we have a very strong Center for Jewish Studies on campus, and that we're the campus with the largest Jewish museum. I didn't know if you knew that, Zach, that Berkeley has its own Jewish museum. It's the largest Jewish museum on any university campus in the United States. Really makes Berkeley sort of an awesome place to learn Hebrew literature, Hebrew poetry, Yiddish, Jewish history, modern Israel, whether it's Israeli law or Israeli society. I now teach a class on Israeli politics. So if in the distant past, I think there was a period where people were sort of hesitant to come to Berkeley because of its attitudes towards Judaism and towards Israel, we're now in a period where students are coming to Berkeley because they want to study Judaism and Israel, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm. Now, with all of your expertise, do policymakers tend to like turn to you or other experts with like because of your knowledge? And does that really make a difference in shaping public policy?
Rarely. It varies from political scientist to political scientist. Some of us just want to study questions because we're curious. We want to find out what the answer is. So in that sense, we're like philosophers. Some of us study topics that don't really have a really strong sort of policy implication. Maybe we're trying to study some historical event or some complex relationship between this factor and that factor that doesn't really sort of shape the world. But for people like me who study war and peace, or you can imagine my colleagues who study nuclear weapons, who study terrorism, who study poverty, elections, if we put in a little bit of effort, we can sometimes reach some policymakers. They don't tend to read our books. They don't tend to subscribe to our journals, and they don't sit in our classroom. Although I'd like to hope that there are future politicians sitting in my classroom. Mm-hmm. So what I have to do is once I publish a book or an article, I have to then write it up as an op-ed, send it out to people, make sure that I'm interviewed, on radio, on TV. And then sometimes I'll get questions. And it usually won't be the White House calling, but it might be decision makers at different levels. So years ago, for example, I wrote an article about how the U.S. dealt with fighting terrorists in Iraq near mosques and what happens when those mosques get damaged. And I then had a series of inquiries from people at the Pentagon, at the Department of Defense. Do you have any advice for us? Do you think we could have handled it better? What do? I don't know that they heeded my advice, But it was nice to see that somebody was interested in it,
Mm-hmm.
that I wasn't just sort of locked in an ivory tower.
Now, obviously, Israel can be a very controversial topic. How do you really have a successful dialogue or conversation with an academic perspective?
It's not so hard. Israel is no more a controversial topic than, in my mind, just about any other country in the world. Unless you're studying Belgium or Switzerland, which are boring. If you're studying an interesting part of the world, it's going to be controversial to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, you can get into real fights over Belgium if you just know who to have a conversation with, right? You could find a couple of people in the Netherlands and in France. You can get them riled up about Belgium. So I'm going to answer your question as if you asked me about any other country. China is controversial. Russia is controversial. India is controversial. Any big, powerful country is going to be controversial. Number one, you have to be open to ideas and theories you disagree with. This is becoming less and less fashionable. It used to be in the United States that only the right wing in the United States was sort of closed-minded and anti-academic and unwilling to read broadly and openly. But now I'm seeing more and more that even on the American left, people think that, language is violent, and if you disagree with my ideas, you're doing me some form of harm, you're discriminating against me because of your words. And, espousing certain ideas is a form of oppression, all that bullshit. When in reality, there's nothing more important than listening to words you disagree with. If all you do is listen to words you agree with, you're not going to grow intellectually. Your ideas are never going to be questioned. You're never going to learn anything new. So number one, you need to understand that words are just conveyors of ideas. And anybody in a classroom, in any academic setting, has the right to say whatever they like and speak their mind openly without having to worry that somebody's going to shut them down or tell them which words they can use and not use, or what language is correct and incorrect. So that's, I think, rule number one. Rule number two is you need facts. You need to distrust the facts that you already know and gather as many new facts, especially facts that sort of go contrary to your expectations. So before we start my class on war in the Middle East, which I told you is not a history class, nonetheless, the first 4 weeks are history. I got to teach students, we do geography. I got to show you the map. I need you to be able to find the Palestinian territories on a map. Capital cities, important rivers. I need you to know ancient history. I need you to know medieval history. I need you to know early modern and modern history. And read that history from as many different points of view as possible. So don't just read the Arab story. Don't just read the Israeli story. Don't just read the Persian story. Read all these stories side by side. And if you find that they contradict one another, great. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. And you have to be able to hold those contradictions in your head. And then just the rules of polite discourse. You don't attack people for who they are. You don't attack people at all. But you certainly don't criticize people for who they are, right? You're not allowed to have this opinion because your skin color is like that. And you're not allowed to have that opinion because your skin color is like this. Or you're a man, so you're not allowed to speak on behalf of this group. If you're going to criticize somebody, you criticize their ideas and not their appearance and not their identity. I disagree with your idea because I disagree with the fact you presented because you left out this other fact. I disagree with your argument because it's circular or because it's logically flawed in some way. I have some other evidence that you need to listen to. And your goal should not be to defeat your opponent. Your goal, I don't even think, should necessarily be to persuade. Your goal should be to teach and to learn. And if you do that, you can't really go wrong. That was a long answer.
Is there anything else that you would like to say to Gen Z to wrap us up?
Yeah, I guess there is one thing I wanted to say, and I wanted to say something about Zionism because it's something that I hear more and more from students on the Berkeley campus when they learn about their own history and they learn about Israel and its complexities, and that is the following. I think there are multiple ideological and religious trends among young Jews in the United States that are, some are natural, some are surprising, some are inevitable. I think there's a decline in synagogue attendance. I think there's a rise in intermarriage. I think you're likely to find fewer and fewer Jews who keep kosher, who attend religious services regularly. I think in that context, in the context of a changing American Judaism, I think the connection between young American Jews of the Gen Z, their connection to Israel is more important now than it's ever been before. And I think that's often forgotten. I think as the other glues that bind us together are dissolving, we no longer live only among Jews in Jewish neighborhoods. I think that's great. We no longer marry only Jews. We sometimes raise mixed families. I actually think that's great too. We no longer eat in restaurants of our own and only drink our own wine. Some of us don't keep kosher. Some of us keep kosher some of the time. I think as some of these bonds are dissolving and new bonds are forming, the one thing that keeps us united is a relationship to our homeland, a relationship to our language, a relationship to our common culture and our history, and a relationship to Zionism. And so that doesn't mean that you have to emigrate to Israel tomorrow. Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that you have to support all or even most of the actions of Israel. In fact, you can criticize Israel left, right, and center, as all Israelis do all the time, 100% of the time. But it does mean that you have to foster in your community a relationship to that place, that you should visit it, that you should know it, that you should speak its language somewhat, that you should involve yourself in its affairs. Criticize it all the time. That's a great way to involve yourself in its affairs. Understand what motivates people there. Support them and insist that they support you, right? Americans supporting Israelis, Israelis supporting Americans. I think that relationship is super important. That's why I was one of the people who helped create this institute on the Berkeley campus for the study of Israel. Without a future for Israel, there's no future for Judaism in the United States. And the Jews among us who have become so secularized that they no longer pray together, they no longer speak Hebrew, they no longer attend Sunday school, they no longer keep kosher, they no longer attend a synagogue, and they also have no relationship to the largest Jewish community in the world. Once that last connection is lost, that's the end of the road for Judaism and their family. And so I think it's really important for the health of and the future of Gen Z in the United States. That's my soapbox.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hassner, for coming on today. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
You're super welcome, Zach. It was delightful talking to you.
Thank you. Bye.